It is really wonderful to have such a really incredible turnout for a very damp, very wet, very chilly night. And I appreciate that. And I also know that it's a testament both to sort of the tenacity of BCRW audiences, as well as to the stature and the interest in Anna Tsing's work, who is our speaker tonight. This is the final BCRW event of the semester, and it is a really, really exciting end to a semester that's been full of extremely vibrant talks and conferences. We are very proud this evening to host our annual Helen Pond McIntyre Lecture and to host, as part of that, one of the preeminent feminist scholars of anthropology, Anna Lowenhaupt Tsing. Anna Tsing holds faculty positions as an anthropologist at the University of California, Santa Cruz, where I had the pleasure of being her former colleague, and at Aarhus University in Denmark, where she co-directs the university's research project, Living in the Anthropocene. Anna, as all of you know, is a prolific scholar who has edited and authored a number of highly influential books, including Shock and Awe, War on Words, In the Realm of the Diamond Queen, Friction and Ethnography of Global Connection, and The Mushroom and at the End of the World, on the Possibility of Life in Capitalist Ruins. Through this path-breaking body of work, Anna Tsing uses a feminist analysis to ground her engagements with gender, power, global interconnection, and the discipline of anthropology itself. Encouraging us to think complexly about diverse phenomena, Anna's work consistently creates new conceptual and analytical frameworks and tools for understanding the world in which we find ourselves and the worlds we have created. Most notably, perhaps, her notion of friction, what she calls awkward, unequal, unstable, and creative qualities of interconnection across difference, is a concept that has transcended her own discipline of anthropology to be taken up by feminist and critical theorists more broadly as a way of foregrounding and explaining the messiness of contemporary capital and of life itself. Anna Tsing is the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship and a Niels Bohr Professorship from the Danish Research Council, Danish National Research Foundation. And working in collaboration with her colleagues Laura Baer, Karen Ho, and Sylvia Yanagisako, she's Generating Capitalism, a group that uses feminist approaches to challenge both an essentialist model of capitalism and the boundedness of the domain of the economic. Like much of her previous work, this recentering of a nuanced engagement with feminist political economy gives us another powerful set of tools for making sense of contemporary processes of capital accumulation. We are thrilled to hear the next chapter of Anna's always dazzling, rigorous, and breathtakingly original thinking. And we are deeply honored to host her this year as the Helen Pond McIntyre Lecturer. Please join me in welcoming Professor Anna Lowenhaupt Tsing.
Thank you very much. I'm really thrilled and honored to be able to come and speak to you today. And I hope you'll forgive me for not having slides and wanting you to just listen to the text. And I'm also I'm not going to talk about matsutake mushrooms, although I love having them in front of the room. And the book about them is sitting in the back, and I'm glad to tell you what's in that slide later on, but it's not the main point of my lecture today. When I accepted this engagement, I set myself a challenge. I would use the talk, I thought, to work on a feminist analysis of the Anthropocene, the proposed geological epoch in which human disturbance to planetary ecosystems outweighs that of the glaciers. I've been involved in an interdisciplinary project on the Anthropocene, and it's nagged at me that feminist insights are so rarely used in our discussions, and that indeed, and that could be a whole other talk, many prominent Anthropocene writers offer egregious forms of masculinist thinking. But how best to use feminist theory has not been a simple question for me. Some feminists have argued against the word. Some have looked at how environmental disasters have had disparate effects on women and men. And some have questioned the hegemony of the so-called natural world through feminist insights. These are all important, but not my challenge. I've wanted to approach the Anthropocene head-on, that is, to explore how masculine domination is implicated in that set of catastrophes we call Anthropocene. That's an old-fashioned question and not put yet right. Without a feminist movement to guide us to questions that matter, it's impossible to get it right. Still, feminist scholars know a few things that matter, and it's part of our job, I think, to pause sometimes to ask what they are. Given the question, let me reassure you, this will not be a sermon. My goal is to usher some feminist thinkers and fields into the interdisciplinary discussion sponsored by the word Anthropocene. I imagine you asking, why bother with Anthropocene given the term's flaws? There's a politics in the making, and I want to be part of it. If we are to survive capitalist and colonial insults, we need a social movement for livability. Thus, to my strategy, if this is about a political space, a grand story matters less than the chance to open some doors. The academy is implicated. For the first time in my lifetime, natural scientists are looking for help from humanists in knowing the world. I'm interested in keeping that conversation going even across philosophies, because some important radical ideas are coming from the scientists. That goal changes what I can tap from feminist theory. Still, feminist scholars know a few things that matter even to scientists. We know, for example, that a universal timeline, the most common reading of Anthropocene, is not enough to know the uneven histories of human-made non-livability. Why, indeed, would it ever occur to anyone that there's a single universal history of human disturbance on Earth? That question's an easy one. The European Enlightenment encouraged such habits of thought. Man, the Enlightenment figure, arose in dialogue with God. He inherited God's universalism, including his singular temporality. I've approached the heart of the thoughts I prepared today. Man, that capital M Enlightenment figure, is ensconced at the center of Anthropocene. The worst flaw of Anthropocene as a concept might best help me to address my challenge. Exploring man is a way to know Anthropocene. And every time I use the word man, just listen for that specifying capital M. Social and cultural theorists have a constitutive ambivalence about this guy, and this might serve my quest. On the one hand, he authorizes us. He gave rise to our disciplines. After all, I'm an anthropologist set to study man. He gives us, as Edward Said once put it, permission to narrate. On the other hand, we've made an industry of arguing against him. We've studied his contradictions, his exclusions, and his mistakes. We've observed the idiocy of his confusions between masculinity, whiteness, Christian secularism, and the falsely imagined universal. In the end, we turned our backs and tried to forget about him. But maybe it's time to call out responsibility. How does that capital M guy make the Anthropocene? Not single-handedly, but with gusto. My Anthropocene, then, Earth stalked by man. An analysis of man cannot follow him obliviously into universals. Instead, I imagine an Anthropocene broken into uneven and unequal patches. Consider it this way. Anthropocene matters because livability is threatened by the repercussions of human activities. We experience livability only through places. Anthropocene is enacted in places even as it is in global circulation. Thus, I begin to wander on a broken path informed by feminist theory. Given the circulation of air, water, and life, Anthropocene may always be global, yet Anthropocene is also always parochial, perspectival, and performative. This is true not just because various people imagine Anthropocene differently, or even just because global systems impact various kinds of people differently. It's more than this. Anthropocene is patchy because it's composed of varied assemblages of livability. It exists only in and through these patches. Thinking through landscape patches, I've considered Anthropocene through the figure of the plantation. By plantation, I mean those ecological simplifications in which living things are transformed into resources, future assets, by removing them from their life worlds. Plantations are machines of replication, ecologies devoted to purification and the production of the same. As feminist scholars from Jill Cassett in the Caribbean to Annette Weiner in Oceania to Paula Ebron in the American South have shown, disentangling things in this way is really exotic. To make resources, that is, disentangled things, requires cultural work. Let's call this work alienation, whether it involves humans or non-humans. Alienation creates the possibilities of machines of replication, which turn out to be efficient producers of assets, which can be turned again into future assets, and indeed help produce that model of the future we call progress. Alienation, with its simplified ecologies, produces the environmental dilemmas we call Anthropocene. Thinking through plantations, the patchy Anthropocene is immediately apparent. As ubiquitous as plantation landscapes are today, they're not everywhere. There are still many landscapes of multi-species entanglement. Yet plantations are energized by the possibilities of proliferation. Proliferation, a word that comes to us from cancer and nuclear weapons. Cancer, almost by definition, cannot be everywhere. Cancer develops in organisms of non-cancerous cells. Yet it proliferates, so too with nuclear weapons and plantations. There's a tangle and a muddle here. Plantations spread everywhere. They are modern proliferation. As machines of replication, plantations manufacture proliferation. Yet everywhere they're formed in vernacular histories, which tie them to the contingencies of encounters and the peculiarities of place. They can never be everywhere because they depend on the multi-species assemblages they simplify. The tangle and the muddle have each been feminist forms of analysis. This is the first of the handful of reflections and stories I offer tonight, in which I'll call out feminist approaches to make something of the patchy Anthropocene. Between Muddles and Tangles, Marilyn Strathern and Donna Haraway. The dialogue between Marilyn Strathern and Donna Haraway, including their marvelous rewrites of each other, inspires me to infect the Anthropocene with interruptions and dis-ease. This has been a long relation full of infectious products, Haraway's sympoiesis. Haraway paraphrases Strathern in a Haraway mode. It matters what categories we use to think other categories with. Strathern credits Haraway with introducing the partial connection, her own signature contribution. Strathern is the feminist theorist of awkward relations and interrupting categories. She guides us to things that do not fit together and yet somehow are together. In contrast to a Marxist contradiction, for Strathern, bifurcations do not lead anywhere. There's no synthesis, but instead a chance to reflect on the interruption. She asks us to patiently sit in a muddle, not trying to solve it, but to take the time to consider incommensurability. This is Strathern's feminism, which emerges from untenable sets of distinctions, such as universalism and cultural relativism, in contrast to forms of structuralism, in which dichotomies are algorithms to set the world in motion like a machine. Strathern's bifurcations stop the world in its tracks. Haraway is the feminist theorist of productive melds and infections. Instead of the Anthropocene, Haraway shows us the Thulacene, tangled up in multi-species tentacles. Feminism is a taste for unexpected excess. She puts together disparate forms of knowledge, showing how their juxtaposition creates new fields. Rather than isolate ontologies, she theorizes entanglement. She throws herself into worldly materials, staying with the trouble. If I play with man, sitting him in a muddle, it's in homage to Strathern. If I look for tangles beyond the plantation, it's in homage to Haraway. Muddles and tangles, I need them both. Man is a muddle that must be traced through his tangles. A story from the historical heartland of feminist concerns can illustrate. The 3,000 Little Pigs, or the politics of reproduction. In Denmark, where I live part-time these days, the farming of pigs for export is the country's biggest agricultural industry and a focus for national stories. Pigs are raised in big operations of several thousand animals, but it's important to spokesmen that these are family farms. Denmark became a modern nation through the mobilization of an agricultural cooperative movement, and dreams of modernity have from the first been tied to a countryside of family farms. Pigs are both universal assets and vernacular Danes, the muddle of man. Last March, Inger Anneberg took me on one of her research trips to a pig farm in central Jutland, the Danish mainland. The farm provides such a vivid image of machines of replication that I take the liberty to describe it. Let me take you first to the building in which the breeding sows are penned. The most impressive thing to me was that each animal is classified and managed according to its reproductive status, which is minutely known. We began with the young sows that were becoming reproductively active for the first time. These were held together in a pen close to the main door for easy observation. Through tracking the color of their external genitalia, the farmers know exactly when each sow is coming into heat. As soon as the vulva is red enough, the sow is inseminated. And as soon as pregnancy is confirmed, the sow is shifted into a series of different pens, each indicating exactly how many days the pregnancy has proceeded. The farmers know exactly when she'll give birth, and everything's prepared for the piglets. These sows have varied numbers of teats, from 10 to 18, and since piglets have their special teats, the mothers cannot nurse more piglets than they have teats. But the farmers have calculated an average of 14 teats, unless they adjust the insemination mixture to make 14 piglets. 4 extra piglets from a sow with 10 teats are given to a sow with 18 teats. And as soon as possible, the piglets are removed from their mother so that the sow can go back to making more piglets. Because the piglets are removed so quickly before they have adequate immune systems, they're fed antibiotics. They're disengaged even from their intestinal bacteria. All of this makes the sows reproduce to their full maximum. The farm is a machine of replication. Sows and piglets are assets to be managed efficiently. Efficiency is accomplished by tailorizing the process of reproduction and by removing impediments through a sterile and closely monitored living space. The great-grandfather of the farmer, whom I'll call Mas, started the central Jutland farm as a participant in a 19th century nationalist mobilization to make more land into modern family farms. The Danes had lost their best farmland in a war with Germany, and as the saying went, what was lost without shall be gained within. This national charter for modern family farms shaped subsequent contradictions. When Mas's parents decided to upgrade their mixed farm in 1980, they would have liked to move into dairy, but they looked at the numbers, Mas told us, and they realized that only pigs were possible. The numbers told them family enterprise here is the plantation, closely monitored and yet the Danish family. This is the plantation in contradiction, both transcendent and localized. After all, Mas explained, they're not like the hypermodern Dutch who've turned pig farms into warehouse-like factories. Here is a vernacular history in which man emerges with Jutlandic characteristics. Here is the local in which the global erupts. The knot, combining family intimacy and industrial disengagement, seemed particularly clear to me in a set of conversations about pig sexuality. Mas was explaining how to inseminate the sows using a long plastic tube inserted into a sow's vagina. In contrast to a cow, a sow needs to contract some internal muscles to bring in the semen. Each time Mas described the process, he would stop dramatically, hesitate for a long moment, and then use the word orgasm for this process. Once he was describing the patience necessary since the sow does not immediately respond. A colleague of mine asked what he does during the wait. Does he stimulate the sow? He texts his wife, a Danish researcher jumped in. Mas immediately agreed and began to mime the process of intently texting while idly holding the insemination tube. Here's the tension between intimacy and attachment at the heart of the family as industrial farm. This is sex, and this is not sex. Thus, the machine of replication takes on its Danish form. And yet, too, there's something else, a hidden force that emerges in this muddle of general and particular, and that drives the two both apart and together. Antibiotic resistance infectious bacteria that emerged in that most plantation-like of human spaces, the hospital, have spread to most all of Denmark's pig farms. The ubiquity of antibiotics gives them dominance here. To protect both pigs and us from infection, we're suited from boots to hair. We look a little like Ebola nurses. Indeed, the spread of these bacteria has challenged a cherished national ritual, the visit of school children to the pig farm. Debates about pig farm safety reestablished the vernacular limits of the replication machine, even as they simultaneously support its further proliferations, as in our safety suits. Virulence is business as usual on the plantation. Virulence both underlines the generality of the replication machine in its proliferations and parochializes it. The plantation itself begins to appear like a disease-like eruption, even as it breeds its own pathogens. These mites on mites may shake it up or extend it across vast new terrains. Extending from this muddle, the tangles of the puzzle we call man emerge. The Hidden Force. The Hidden Force is the name of a novel by Louis Couperus about the effects of colonialism in the Netherlands East Indies. It takes me on a detour into the colonial worlds that produced anthropology as well as plantations. Post-colonial feminist theory is my guide. Man erupts in colonial encounters. Colonial encounters show us man as an eruption. The simultaneous production of man's universality and the provincial vernacular histories that tie him to place are acutely visible in this space in which incommensurability is everyday practice. But let me begin more than a century before Couperus's 1900s novel to peek in on 18th century Java as described by historian Jean Taylor's amazing history, The Social World of Batavia. Here's a vivid illustration of what I mean by the eruption of man. In those days, the tropics were seen as unhealthy for white women, and colonial officials arrived as single men. They got involved with local women, and they had mixed-race children. To take care of those children, they sent the boys to Holland for their educations, but they kept the girls home and married them to the next generation of young men arriving from Holland. To get anywhere in the colonial hierarchy, young men found it expedient to marry their seniors' mixed-race daughters. But those young women were creatures of the Indies. They chewed betel, staining their teeth red. They listened to gamelan music as servants held royal parasols over their heads. The European men were disgusted and terrified. They had to get out of the house. The men formed clubs, and together they discovered linguistics, archaeology, history, and science. Western civilization emerged in their frantic endeavors to avoid their wives. Simultaneously provincial and full of universal spirit, this is an eruption of man. Colonial eruptions of man were not limited to white men. In the early 20th century, a group of elite young Javanese became enthralled with man. Becoming man, they learned to be anti-colonial agitators and eventually built a revolutionary movement. This process is described in Premudia and Antatora's historical sequence, the Buru Quartet, and especially in its first novel, This Earth of Mankind. Premudia describes the coming of age of proto-nationalist Javanese youth whose horizons are expanded by the dream of modernity, this earth of mankind. Despite the racist antics of his colonial teachers, who have the nerve to call him monkey, he reaches out to this would-be universal. It opens his awareness to discussion of rights. It inspires his fight against colonial discrimination. Again, this is an eruption of man. Those without white Christian Y chromosomes can also navigate these waters. Yet neither whites nor natives could avoid the hidden force, the virulent magic and maleficence of the colonial encounter. The hidden force emerges from the very architecture of man with its life world disengagements. The more pure the rationality of man, the stronger the hidden force. The hidden force bedevils the colonial administrator in Couperus's novel of that name. Unspeakable things happen and without explanation. The protagonist tries to ignore the effects of his rationalization programs on the colonial society he's helped to craft. But the unspeakable haunts him, slipping through the cracks of the walls, splattering his European wife with bright red beetle spit, even though she's entirely protected, it would seem, in her bath. Like antibiotic resistant bacteria, the hidden force emerges from the projects of man. In the novel, it undermines those projects, limiting their imagined universality. Sometimes, too, this occurs in the world. Fordlandia. The name is so redolent with myth that I can do no better to repeat it as the title of my next story. Fordlandia, the great entrepreneur Henry Ford's rubber plantation in the Amazon jungle and the site of a dream of modern progress. Fordlandia, straight lines of whitewashed houses, gleaming machinery, and the marching rows of clean, weeded rubber trees leading toward efficiency, wealth, and power. Then, a few years later, Fordlandia, rusting ruins, encroaching mud, an abandoned water tower, Ann Stoller's imperial debris. Fordlandia was an eruption of man in Brazil in the late 1920s and 1930s. Even more than Danish pigs, Fordlandia takes us into the tangles and muddles of man as he stalks the earth. Fordlandia is man in his most general form, the machine of replication, and also at his most strange and particular, entwined and emerging from the petty contingencies of history. Then, too, there's the hidden force, the force of proliferation, and also its limit. I follow Barry Machado's nicely tangled version of this history. Through much of the 1920s, he explained, a network of imperialism and intrigue made good use of Ford, the era's great entrepreneur. Henry Hoover, then U.S. Secretary of Commerce, had spread the word that Americans must have their own rubber, a strategic resource that should be free from other imperial interests. The first efforts to follow this up looked to the Philippines, then a U.S. colony, but Filipino nationalists blocked them. In this climate, Brazilian would-be comprador capitalists emerged, and they courted Ford, who had not previously been interested in rubber. In 1927, a secret cabal involving a Brazilian businessman, an American consular secretary, the Pará governor, a British facilitator, and a local mayor succeeded in making Ford an offer he could not refuse. Ford signed and hired staff to open his plantation. But Brazilian politics was a hotbed of oppositional factions, and another group tipped local journalists about the machinations behind Ford's deal. In 1928, the journalists spread the story of the cabal. Ford was shocked, according to Machado. He had never visited Brazil and had not been paying attention to the politics. But now the plantation was already coming into being. Ford fired his staff, American and Brazilian. Instead, he hired an honest man he could trust, a Norwegian-American ship captain. The fact that the captain knew nothing about Brazil or rubber was a recommendation. Meanwhile, the governor of Pará changed and the new officials were hostile to Ford. Ford responded by closing the plantation to the world. It was see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil. Without local dialogue, the captain and his successors managed the plantation in an almost parodied version of white modern order, an eruption of man in both his most squeaky clean general and his most entangled in contingency form. From the first, it was a disaster. Plantation managers tried to make a modern place for labor with wages instead of trade goods and with expectations of abstention from wine and women. The Brazilian workers, both caboclo and indigenous, found these conditions incomprehensible and refused to follow them. There were riots. But the crowning disasters came from the non-humans. As a machine of replication, the plantation sped up the growth not just of rubber trees, but also of their adversaries. To appreciate how plant pathologies became the hidden force, I need to tell you a little about the fungus that causes rubber leaf blight, Microcyclus uli. This fungus spreads slowly and causes little harm when rubber is surrounded by other trees, as in the Amazon forest. But take a plantation in which all the other trees have been removed and rubber trees have been planted cheek and jowl, a machine of replication. A new mode of fungal proliferation kicks in, already an attribute of the fungus, but energized by the plantation. Their quickly produced asexual spores merely have to pass from one leaf to a similar touching leaf to infect a new tree. Meanwhile, the plantation is structured to speed up and synchronize the flush of young leaves. The fungus, which infects only young leaves, flourishes in this new regime of growth. The architecture of the plantation promotes not just the growth of rubber, but also the proliferation of rubber leaf blight. In Fordlandia, rubber leaf blight exploded, and all the trees died. Rubber leaf blight was already well known in the 1920s. If Fordlandia had not shielded itself from outside influences, both local and foreign, perhaps things would have been arranged differently. Indeed, eventually, some operations were moved to a drier site, Belterra, where workers assiduously top-grafted, inspected, and washed the trees to deter insects and fungi. Still, almost no rubber was produced throughout the experiment. To this day, no one produces rubber in plantation in Brazil. Rubber plantations are limited to Asia and Africa, where Brazilian seeds were transported without accompanying fungi. It's telling that the United Nations has placed rubber leaf blight on its list of biological weapons. It would not take a terrorist plot to spread the fungus, destroying plantation economies. The fact that this spread has not happened so far is testimony to the gaps between plantations, the patchy Anthropocene. Fordlandia was an eruption of man, more clearly visible because of its failure. Most accounts focus on Henry Ford as tragic hero. Fordlandia appears as a homunculus from Henry Ford's brain. I picked Machado because his version evades this trap, which covers up the eruption of man. If heroism is blocking our view, it's time to turn to that story. Heroism is botulism. In her essay, The Carrier Bag Theory of Fiction, Ursula Le Guin quotes a Virginia Woolf glossary in which Woolf defines heroism as botulism. This delightfully unexpected definition can again reframe the problem of livability in the Anthropocene. Woolf's heroism returns me to the hidden force in the plantation's simplified ecology. Botulism is a form of food poisoning most commonly associated with canning. The anaerobic world inside the can may encourage the growth of toxin-producing Clostridium botulinum bacteria. These bacteria are common in soil and water, but they only produce toxins under special conditions, such as life inside a can. Aluminum cans are a nice icon of industrial simplification. The botulism in the can is an excess produced from the heart of modernity. Heroism, the storyline of modern man, is thus readable indeed as botulism. Heroic conquests from big dams to mass relocations have been dangerous acts erasing many lives. Livability in the Anthropocene is threatened by just those heroic storylines and practices that are thought to have made man great. Are there alternatives to heroism, botulism? Le Guin's essay suggests carrier bags as another way to tell a story. Collecting offers stories with more complex arcs of temporality, she argues. Instead of a hero single-handedly making the future, there are entanglements and losses of many kinds. My admiration for this idea is one reason I designed this talk as a carrier bag for feminism facing many eruptions of man. Instead of a single arrow of time, I'm searching for the multiple times of landscape assemblages. But there's more, even in my own story. In including the botulism, I just smuggled collaborators into my text, carrying them with me. Botulism comes from a joint introduction I'm writing with Heather Swanson, Elaine Gann, and Niels Bubant for a volume we're co-editing, Arts of Living on a Damaged Planet. In the conference we organized to gather stories from the Anthropocene, Ursula Le Guin was the keynote speaker. To imagine Arts of Living, we needed the legacy of fantastic and real feminist visions, where Le Guin stands with fellow writers such as Octavia Butler and Gloria Anzaldúa. The other speakers were men and women, and some probably never thought about feminism, which diffused quietly through the conference. Yet it gave us an odd outlook compared to many of those committed to telling the Anthropocene. One group that's gained much attention are the eco-modernists who promise to lead us into a good Anthropocene. Their tools are capitalism, technology, and classical philosophy. More alienation, they argue, will fix the ills of current alienation. They aren't worried about the hidden forces their interventions will let loose. Like other engineers before them, they trust in man. I think of them as the inheriting sons, the ones who argue that the master's tools will allow us to refurbish the master's house. I'm referring, of course, to Audre Lorde's "The Master's Tools Will Never Dismantle the Master's House." These sons of man don't want to dismantle, but just to keep building. Another prominent set of Anthropocene writers are the ones I think of as the rebel sons. They immerse themselves in the wild, working up the strength to cast off the mantle of the father, the evils of civilization. In their quests in deserts, forests, and oceans, they confuse their commitment to the environment with masculine self-making. They, too, are sons of man. Are there other genres of telling, even for men? Might there not be a third son position, for example, like the Espen lad of folk tales, mocked for sitting in the ashes, yet adept at making friends with animals and spirits when he sets out for a journey? Catastrophe and mourning. That phrase comes from feminist geographer Leslie Head, who argued at a recent Anthropocene conference that these should be our themes. Indeed, to continue the story of the hidden force in the plantation, I need to explain that it's not just industrial operations that are hit, but the rest of the world, proliferation. There's no better Espen lad story than that told by botanist Oliver Rackham. Rackham devoted his career to woodlands. He was not interested in little visited wilderness, but rather the long inhabited places made by human and non-human histories. He watched the kind of trees that come up in abandoned fields and recover after being cut. If we care about livability, whether for ourselves or for others, the vitality and diversity of anthropogenic woodlands is important. Rackham's book, Woodlands, started my descent into the patchy Anthropocene. Before I read it, I thought of diseases, pests, and invasive species as a necessary result of human travel and trade, part of what it means, perhaps, to be human. Rackham suggested something else. Casual introductions of pests are not the problem. Most ecologies can recover from casual introductions. For plants, it's the industrialization of the tree nursery industry with its large-scale global export of soils and plants that causes both the rate and the virulence of the contemporary spread of pathogens and the resulting decline of even our most common trees. This caught my attention. This is not the work of ordinary people. This is man in his avatar, the plantation. Worse yet, this is the plantation mixing itself into the woodlands, the still entangled ecologies of the non-plantation world. This is the Anthropocene's proliferation in all its dangers. A whole avenue for potential research unfolds from this insight. Follow the patchy Anthropocene through its industrial processes and their unintentional effects. The industrialization of plant and plant-produced transfers has two effects. First, it moves pathogens around at a mind-boggling scale, blocking plant recovery. As Rackham put it, catastrophes are not necessarily abnormal. It's the rate of catastrophes every few years instead of once a millennium that matters. He continues, globalizing tree planting inevitably tends to globalize tree diseases, particularly those that can hybridize and generate virulent strains. Here he has touched on the second way industrial assemblages move beyond their boundaries. Plantations are breeding grounds for virulence. The industrialization of plants breeds pathogenicity. Thus, for rubber leaf blight, a new kind of proliferation became possible, augmenting the abilities of the fungus. Industrial trade also transforms pathogens. Plant predators and pathogens hybridize and create forms that attack new hosts when they're brought together in the industrial plant and plant products trade. New virulence arises to threaten our intimate companions. Plantations and industrial trade bring forth new biologies and ecologies, the catastrophe we call Anthropocene. Rackham suggests that one decent way to mourn is to increase our curiosity about the human and non-human interchange that together makes our worlds. Feminist science and science studies can help. Feminist monsters. Historian Kate Brown has written a brilliant book about twin plutonium-making cities in Russia and the United States in the mid-20th century. At the Arts of Living conference I mentioned, she spoke about the sufferings of old residents of the plutonium district in Russia. They had a host of ailments ranging from pain to insomnia to sudden inflammations. Yet doctors had not found anything. Their patients had none of the most common radioactivity-associated cancers. After Russia adopted Euro-American medical standards, the doctors even stopped keeping records of these symptoms, since they fit no diagnostic code. The residents felt frustrated and disowned. Microbiologist Margaret McFall-Nye, another conference participant, listened to Brown's talk with interest. She recognized every symptom Brown listed from her own research, which concerns interspecies relations in the development of organisms, including humans. Rather than being diffuse complaints, a product of bad living, as doctors had argued, McFall-Nye thought that all those ailments could easily arise from one cause: mutations in intestinal bacteria. Chronic doses of radiation that might not yet have stimulated a human cancer could easily have caused bacterial mutations. The plutonium district residents were suffering from the ills of their interspecies dependencies. Suffering from the ills of another species, the hidden force. This suffering is not just a matter of empathy, but also of material interdependence. We're all mixed up with other species. We can't live without them. Without intestinal bacteria, we can't digest our food. Without plants and animals, we can't make a life. We can't be human. We are monsters, chimeras in the classic sense, like that creature with the head of an ass and the breasts and belly of a woman. That was the papal ass that Martin Luther railed against in calling for a Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther spoke for man, the one who can defend himself because his self is autonomous, not mixed up with others. He does not need others to survive. Alienation is his basic state, and thus the state he requires of all others. That man erupted strongly in 20th century biology, a science devoid of chimeras. Biology's 20th century modern synthesis combined Darwinian evolution and Mendelian genetics into a machine of replication. Genes make organisms. Organisms make populations. Populations make species. Thus, we are always entirely ourselves. Alienation filters up and down, creating bastions of self-making at every scale. Biology as a science of replication needs no encounters and no history. Calculation is made easy. Survival is each against all, and man is in charge. And yet, from this refutation of monsters, new monstrosities emerged, threatening to kill us all. Sometime in the recent past, those algorithms stopped working for many practicing biologists. There were just too many exceptions, organisms that depended on each other for their very being. For Margaret McFall-Nye, it was the bobtailed squid, which needs Vibrio bacteria to elude predators. For Lynn Margulis, it was the coming together of bacteria in the evolution of nucleated cells. In my intellectual development, it was the interdependence of fungi and trees, without which there would be no forests. The self-sufficiency of man has started to crumble. We find our bodies entangled with bodies of other species. We need them to survive. But this too is vulnerability. Monsters are fragile. Break the coordination and the whole thing falls apart. In the grip of the Anthropocene, our coordinations are in danger. Red-knot birds fly 5,000 miles to feast on the eggs of horseshoe crabs in Delaware Bay. Industrial use of the crabs has reduced their population, tipping the birds into certain extinction. The birds are suffering the ills of another species. This is the problem for residents of Russia's former plutonium district. It's the problem, too, for our companion trees struck down by plantation pathogens. Arising from the work of alienation, the hidden force exceeds the expectations of man, creating new forms of unlivability. My passion here reflects a complaint. Why is it that social and cultural theorists have been so reluctant to recognize environmental catastrophe? It's not just the word Anthropocene that puts theorists off. There's something about the idea of environmental disaster that irks us. At first, I thought the problem was that we're hooked on hope. But then I realized that we're ready to talk about other bad news, whether the mistreatment of refugees or the marginalization of the poor. No, I think it's something about man that gets in the way, disallowing our attention to the radical politics put forward by our biological colleagues. It's science. We don't trust it, we don't like it, and we don't want to join, even adding our critical redirections. Science, we think, is a form of man, and we imagine that if we turn our backs to it, we'll enter a brave new world without his interference. Consider how social and cultural theorists have treated ecology. For most political ecologists, ecology is an arm of capitalism and the state. For those involved in indigenous ontologies, ecology is a form of scientific naturalism, the trademark of the West and man. In each case, there are only contrasts to be made between indigenous and vernacular lifeways on the one hand and the observation of scientists on the other. Analysts don't even allow themselves to notice the non-humans they encounter for fear that they might be contaminated by science. This helps explain, indeed, why despite the promises of the new materialism, we learn so little about actually existing non-humans in contemporary cultural and social theory. We learn a lot about philosophies and politics, but very little about the beings themselves. Turning their backs on man, analysts forget to notice the world. We need a better way of confronting man. We need feminism. Let me return to the story of Kate Brown and Margaret McFall-Nye. How does it matter that both are self-consciously feminist scholars? McFall-Nye, for example, used her conference talk not only to tell the audience about new developments in biology beyond the modern synthesis, but also to discuss how these developments have been suppressed by male domination of the field. Male scientists, she claimed, only cite other male scientists, while female scientists cite women and men equally. Dear listeners, check your field. The pioneering work of Lynn Margulis, McFall-Nye argued, has been ignored because she was not a man. After the talks, McFall-Nye and Brown put their heads together to design some research on Russian survivors of low-dose chronic radiation, a project that equally needs a historian and a microbiologist. There's something here that seems to me specific and peculiar about feminist approaches to the politics of science, including biomedicine. On the one hand, science is terrible, infected by male dominance and ready to sponsor many of the worst programs of Euro-American elites, including institutionalized misogyny. On the other hand, science thrums with feminist possibilities, including the work of little recognized women scientists. Science can be adversary or advisor. Consider the difference, for example, between feminist and non-feminist science studies approaches. The latter are not burdened with ambivalence. Science is a mysterious black box that must be opened. The science studies researcher positions himself outside the scientific enterprise, watching and assessing, but not participating. There's no foothold for using science here because the rare and difficult pleasure of becoming a woman scientist is not at stake. There are important things to accomplish this way, but please recall that feminist theory is not just for women scholars. If it's any good, it's because it works, not because women do it. The moment a scholar, male or female, wants to engage with the world, as for example, with the environmental catastrophes we call Anthropocene, he or she is forced to engage with feminist alternatives. We've seen this, for example, in the recent trajectory of science studies pioneer Bruno Latour. If feminist science studies makes any difference, it changes what we think about science more generally. Rather than seeing science as a homogeneous philosophy, it would be a patchy set of landscapes full of heterogeneous assemblages. Eruptions of man would be more or less virulent in different patches. Man would not win over all the patches. Indeed, the idea of total hegemony allows him the power of his own universal claims, thus admitting defeat before we even begin the analysis. Instead of fearing infection by man, then, we might engage with scientific patches, some more terrifying than others. One of the great challenges of feminist theory today is whether to say the word feminism or to let it diffuse throughout all our scholarship. I've mainly been practicing the latter. After all, part of the goal was to make a world in which women scholars did not always have to speak as women. And yet there are times to speak feminist theory to remind ourselves that this is an unfinished social mobilization. How could we have ever imagined that we could study the work of man without feminist theory? In this talk, I've invoked a patchwork of feminist theorists to argue that Anthropocene discussions cannot do without us, and not just one kind of us, but a whole haunted range, a range to be extended and deployed by you, the feminists of the yet to come. if I haven't answered my opening question, it's because I'm challenging you to take it forward in relation to feminist struggles for livability in many different kinds. I've argued that we need to attend to patchy landscapes and to patchy forms of knowledge. I'm aware that to even imagine the Anthropocene as patchy contradicts the universal timeline required by most users of the term. But this is where the feminist theory I've evoked helps me. I'm willing to let fragmented philosophies and fragmented histories sit amongst each other, the better to pay attention to what is possible. When it comes to living landscapes, we need those juxtaposed fragments to even notice them, muddles that give rise to tangles, and vice versa. And if there are patches of entanglement in this earth we've inherited from man, perhaps our job is not just to notice them, but also do our best to keep them in place. Thank you.
I was wondering where feminist theory could tackle emissions. It's something that Anthropocene theorists kind of either want to talk about exclusively or almost not at all, because it sometimes, I think, overshadows other interesting questions. But I mean, I do see emissions as this sort of idea of universality and totality, and seeing the Earth as a system rather than a set of patchy entanglements. And so I'd be really interested to know what you think about them.
I need you to repeat the very beginning, because I missed the key words that you're...
So I was asking about emissions and...
Emission?
Yeah.
Okay. Emissions like of greenhouse gases, that kind of thing?
Yeah, so carbon dioxide as a sort of almost, in a lot of science it's seen as the key driver of climate change, and therefore the Anthropocene.
Should I go ahead and answer, or do you want to take? Okay. I think anthropogenic climate change is a key issue of our times, but my argument is that let's start somewhere else. I understand the major struggle of scientists to argue that there's a planetary whole and that we need to take it seriously, that the planet as a whole is a unit of analysis. But it is and it isn't. And I think that's part of where humanists and social scientists can gain traction with this. So where are those emissions coming from? That's the kinds of questions that we know something about, that before they're all summed up into a great whole, we might need to think about the forms of life that create certain kinds of emissions and what gets taken for granted. And that's where things start to look very patchy.
Thank you for that. I've always been taken by your metaphors, or the metaphors that are almost more than metaphors. And in this talk, I was really taken by the idea of patches, which is a large part of like landscape ecology, is looking at what patches are. And I'm curious as to, there's also resonances with the idea of field work in anthropology and the fact that ecologists also are in fields doing work. But I'm curious as to where this sort of situated idea of the patch came from, in terms of how you read landscape ecology itself to get the idea of the patch.
Mm-hmm. Well, it does come from landscape ecology and trying to make that useful because indeed landscape ecologies are what we need to pay attention to pay attention to livability. I am, just as you said, interested in the idea that certain kinds of scientists do field work just as anthropologists do, and that there can be a kind of empirical curiosity about what you actually see and experience in particular places through field work. So it's the kind of traction that I'm hoping might still keep a conversation going across sciences and humanities, which has been so challenged.
In
science with a capital S, this appeal to this global collective or this unit of analysis comes forth, but that's not a new idea. And it seems like it comes out of these moments of sort of threats to security, where the Anthropocene becomes this threat to human life, human with this capital H again. So I'm curious your thoughts on where this global unit comes from.
Sure, that's a great question. I mean, I was arguing in a one-line throwaway that the universality of God has something to do with the universality of nature, as it was inherited by Enlightenment sciences. And I think geology is particularly important there, because geologists were such a key science of the 18th century that the kind of universalism through which planets were made was just an important part of that transition between a kind of, in Europe, between a religious view of the earth and a secular view of the earth. And so geologists, despite the fact that, of course, if you look at rocks and strata, they're quite uneven in lots of ways, but geologists hold on to that Enlightenment dream of universality, because it's the founding thing of that science. But you're asking something different, too, about the politics of saying we live in one planet right now. And I actually think there's some interesting and important parts of it that, because we also wouldn't want to be reduced to a parochial world where everyone was imagined as living only in their own little cup. So I think the interesting work about, say, the circulation of air and water, and the fact that you put a toxin, you know, that when, say, the Fukushima disaster happened in Japan, it took a very short period of time for that radioactivity to go all the way around the world. So that in that sense, it's actually an important piece to tell us. And yet, we're also responsible to know that that Fukushima disaster depended on a particular set of compromises between US corporations and Japanese government regulators, in which they decided to use cheap construction on their nuclear power and not to go for something that could actually last in an earthquake, to rush through this kind of modernization process. You know, so in that kind of set of contingencies that caused this disaster, there's everything about what was going on between the US and Japan at a particular period, and the kinds of lies that you could tell the public, et cetera. And then this global thing where the winds blew that radioactivity around the world. So somehow it's developing a politics with both of those things in it at the same time.
Anna, you're my heroine, and you're one of the few friends I have of whom I say every 7 to 10 years I have a friend that writes a book, and we're all bobbling in her wake, citing her madly for the next decade while you're effecting another revolution. So I'm presaging and prefacing my remarks with that encomium, okay? Which is this: I'm reading your book. I'm a fan. Our library got it before you received it. I'm reading your Mushroom at the End of the World, and I'm worried about something in it, which is the patch triumphalism. I'm worried about the ways in which you're elevating the notion of, and this comes out of your fervor in being a particularist and an anthropologist, citing your studies and being, if not rooted in place, at least traveling from site to site. And I'm concerned about it because it has a certain aura to it, which is, please forgive me, but this is what I'm concerned about, a kind of coruscated view of modernity, the factory, the engine of capitalism, the stainless steel production system, and it has a certain fragrance of the 60s. It's funky, it's patchy, it's mushrooms, it's fertile. Your pig descriptions, I won't even go there, okay? They were magnificent, okay? But I'm concerned about this because there's a kind of, you're creating a kind of binary that's it smacks of a fundamentalism and an anti-technocratic fundamentalism. So let me leave it there before I really sink my ship. Okay? Remember, I'm still going to be teaching your book this spring, and I'll be swimming, Anna, staying afloat in your wake. Okay?
Anti-technocratic. Okay. My take on the Anthropocene is that we're in pretty big trouble. And I despair at many times about, what the world's going to look like in 100 years, less. A geologist in a talk I was listening had people raise their hands if they thought human civilization was going to exist in 1,000 years. And what was interesting is that none of the scientists thought that. And the humanists all raised their hands. So the reason to go to patchiness is not actually because I think everything is sort of funky and fertile, but actually because it's the only hope we've got is that if there's some corners of livability. I mean, I think there's this spreading unlivability around the world. And, in terms of what's causing unlivability, there are indeed many ways to talk about the unlivable. I think the reason I went to Oliver Rackham is because I think it's hard to accuse Oliver Rackham of being a hippie, and he's a Cambridge botanist, and
I didn't explicitly accuse him. He may have lived in Santa Cruz, but
right. But his argument is so interesting to me, and actually I took it from this patchy Anthropocene stuff from Rackham rather than having gone there originally myself. That his idea that if you're looking at the extinction crisis, that the biggest threats to extinction come from the industrialization of life. That's his argument, and I think it's worth following it up, not because one would want to take it for granted, but rather because if it's true, there's things we can do about it. That the kind of industrial plant trade, which is the nurseries where you would order trees to put out on the roads or something. Actually, we don't have to have that. That's a small thing that's not necessarily tied to the whole of civilization. We could argue against industrial plant trade of certain kinds. And so to me, it's actually small and practical to go that way rather than necessarily taking the whole. So and I'm taking it seriously that it's a research directive that I want to know just how much of the kinds of threats to livability come out of industrial assemblages. So I'm willing to keep an open mind and hear some other alternatives.
Thanks, Anna. Again, so provocative as you were talking, and maybe this relates to the last question, but I was thinking about the humanists, whom you did mention, and what the humanists are to you, and the other science that you do not mention, which is math, and the way that new mathematical models and the new math are really thinking. This is very post-industrial, thinking about systems of complexity that really don't follow, a single, universal, all the ways that we think about the scientific models that really want to think about the ground up with cellular automata and all of this. So I don't know what your thoughts about both math and the humanists who are also the sons and daughters of man, but what they bring to your view. And the person that you did mention, the humanist that was most prominent in your talk was Said, with his permission to narrate. And so I also wanted to ask you about stories, stories and math.
Well, I think math is so important. I mean, that all of our abilities to imagine what's going to happen at this point depend on certain kinds of mathematical abstractions, which many of us don't have the education to even follow. And I'm dying to find out people who know that world and who are open to thinking through indeterminacy and historical contingency and stuff. I think we need them. And that's the humanist we, the feminist theory we, or whatever, that I would love to find, because I think it's true, you're right, that mathematics are also open to and I'm, if anybody knows who those people are, I want to be in touch with them. And in terms of storytelling, yeah, it's part of why I came back to the Virginia Woolf thing. I think the storytelling part of this is really important, that the one insight I've had in trying to work on this program with scientists and humanists in it is that if we start by thinking of our work in terms of genre instead of in terms of philosophy, actually there's a possibility that we could have conversations with each other. That when it comes to genre, we're mostly okay with somebody who wants to write science fiction mysteries. But we've been so allergic to the idea that there could be something that a conversation between humanities and sciences, because we've always thought of it as a philosophy problem, and it's almost like a religion, then you have to convert the other people to your religion if you want to even have a conversation with them. But if you think about it as genre and storytelling styles, you at least have some openings for dialogue.
I wasn't going to ask a question, but the anterior, not Nefertiti's question, the prior one forced me to raise my hand, because I just wanted to say in public that you are not my heroine, but you are my plantation pathogen. And I just wanted to thank you for bringing in all those stories, especially the Fordlandia and of these unexpected revolutions that can happen, right? Where these industrialized modes are missing a logic that may have an opening, that may make us move towards something else. And I was thinking also about your carrier bag, and you put rubber inside of your carrier bag, you put industrialized pigs inside of your carrier bag. And I was thinking about, families, because you started off with the family farm versus the industrialized farm. And there's another blight that also caused the mass migration, which is, the potatoes, for example. Mm-hmm. So one of my favorite feminists, post-humanists, Lucien Gomel, is writing right now about potatoes and the transfer of so many millions of bodies because of the fact that there wasn't a diversification of potatoes in Ireland. Mm-hmm. And I was thinking about how diversity is so important to all of these discussions, and also of the question of race, which you brought up in your lecture as well. And I'm thinking also in trying to weave in Sylvia Wynter and this the coloniality of being, of power, of gender, and of race. And so I just kind of wanted to weave that back into the discussion to see if with this plantation pathogen that you propose as a project within feminist science studies, how else might we think of and do you believe that we can perhaps make it to a post-anthropos?
Well, I'll start with the last one first. I think we already are, and the problem is recognizing it and building from the things that keep those entanglements in place. That since our gut bacteria can poison us as well as digest our foods, the key is to try and respect those entanglements and build a world in which they'll be okay. And I'm glad you brought up race. I felt like I would have liked to have talked a little bit more about the plantation as one of the key sites for making race in the forms that we know it, and that the kinds of alienations and purifications of the plantations, that race is certainly one of the key technologies of kind of cordoning off certain kinds and making them do the work of assets.
Well, please join me in thanking Anna Tsing for an amazing talk. Thank you.